It is 12:31. I'm going to go ahead and launch us off. So welcome everyone to our session today. This is a panel session focusing on equitable practices in learning communities, and we're delighted to have so many of you all joining us. Our hope in this session is to really create space for some questions. We're going to give a broad overview and to introduce the panelists, and I'm going to share my screen to get started, and we will not be sharing the screen the whole time, hopefully, so we can see folks' faces, but we'll share for a bit to get going here. So my name is Molly Jackson, and I am the Assistant Dean for the Colleges Program or Learning Community at University of Washington School of Medicine. And I'm delighted to be here today with our panelists. Can you all see my screen? Yes, all right. So
join the meeting.
So our outline and goals today before we go into our panel introductions, we are going to hope to give you all some specific approaches to improving equity that are embedded within learning communities. And we really asked our panelists to really think about what is most powerful at their own institution in improving equity and addressing concerns around discrimination in all forms. And we're hoping to share some things that worked and some things that did not work at our institutions and make this a real dialogue with you all. We have some outstanding panelists who are going to begin with giving an introduction to themselves, the role that they play at their institution, and tell you a little bit about the learning communities setup at their individual schools. And then we're going to spend about 15 minutes just talking through some domains of ways in which learning communities can play an active role in advancing equity, and then go into some lessons learned. And then we're going to spend the last portion, really hopefully half of our time at least, in a question and answer session with you all, so that this really feels like a panel. So I am going to unscreen share briefly and have folks introduce themselves so you can really see their faces. And then we'll go back to the screen share in a moment. And as we are entering this portion of the panel, I think what I'm going to have you all do is, everyone who has joined us here, it is so fun to see everyone's faces. I think what I'm going to have you all do is turn off your cameras for the portion where our panelists are speaking. And then we're going to have people turn back on their cameras for the Q&A portion. That way we can maximize the chance that you will actually be able to see the human who is speaking on your screen. All right, so we're going to start our panel introductions with Sarah Fazio, who is at Harvard, and then she can pass on to Danica and down the line.
Wonderful. Thank you, Molly. It's so lovely to see everybody here today, and I feel privileged to be part of this austere panel. So, as Molly said, I'm at Harvard Medical School. I'm one of the advisory deans. We have 5 societies, which are our learning communities, and I have been involved in the learning community for about 11 years there. I'm also the chair of the core clinical curriculum. So that's what I do in sort of the other bit of my time at the medical school. We have approximately 30 students per society, per class, and 3 advisors within each of our learning communities. The way that we've done it traditionally has been that the students do their basic science classes as well as their physical diagnosis classes within the learning communities, and we have different people who function as teaching faculty versus advisors and mentors. But once they get to the wards, the advising learning community folks kind of take over that longitudinal element and stay with that community throughout the duration of the time that they are with us. And I guess I'll just, just say briefly, we're going to get into more details about everybody's current experience. It's been, like everywhere, it has been really, I think, a huge struggle for us across all of our learning communities and all of our student years over the past few months. It's really difficult to sort of hold what has been going on. And my sense is then in our first year class, it was perhaps the most challenging because we removed people in the context of COVID, from the place where they had their support systems and sent them home. And then horrible things started happening. And it was really difficult to be there in quite the same way. And we can talk later about sort of how we best did that. And I think there were a few instances within our first year class where a faculty member who was leading a class right around the time that the George Floyd was murdered, the faculty member really just didn't know how to handle it, and the students became very understandably angry, and it created such a big it was such a rift, and it was really difficult to kind of bring our whole community back together again. And we've learned a lot through that, and a lot of it was about how faculty need to listen, and hear and understand people's experiences, and how faculty and students can speak to one another. But it's been hard. We're learning a lot as we go along.
Good afternoon, or whatever time of day it is, wherever you are. We're certainly global in this context. Again, so great to be with you. As Sarah mentioned, it's such a great panel, such a great opportunity, and such an important topic to really shed some light on. I think contextually, one thing that we as panelists wanted to make sure that we convey to the group is that this is really a form of a courageous conversation. Meaning, no one here is perfect, and we'd really like to be able to share with you our experiences as they were lived. And likewise, would love to hear from each of you with regard to your questions and your experiences as they have been experienced. And so the role that I play, so I'm actually at a brand new medical school in contrast to the tenure of Harvard and others that are on this call. We are 2 years into working with students. We've been around for about 5. And I am the Dean of Students at the institution. And we do kind of the typical things that an Office of Student Affairs does. One of those things is that's perhaps a little bit unique and around which our learning communities are actually constructed is we have a physician development coaching initiative. So we actually have trained 12 physicians to serve as executive coaches, and they're partnered with our students across a 4-year spectrum. We've trained those physicians, and so that may actually come into play with maybe some of our conversations later, with a pretty rigorous faculty development construct around a 9-month-long fellowship that had some synchronous and asynchronous components of that. Every person who serves as a coach has to undergo that training at least within 2 years of working with our students. We only have 60 students, which is awesome. I went to a medical school that was much bigger, and that affords us a lot of close proximity. We actually partner those coaches together into pairs, so that we actually have 6 teams. And then we have 10 students per academic year per 2 coaches. And so that's the construct of our learning communities. Ours is completely removed from assessment. And so the coaches are actually not involved. They are faculty, obviously, they're all physicians, but they're not involved in any way with clinical skills or other components of how, some learning communities work and function. And again, the primary format for that is coaching. And so we've actually partnered with the International Coaching Federation to formulate some of that fellowship that actually helped our coaches to train. We also have a 4-year compassionate practice or a communication curriculum here at the school that also informed the other half of that fellowship. And so from a training standpoint, all of our coaches undergo both training as a coach and training in communication. And then kind of built into the communication component of that is certainly looking at standard things that should be very standard around dimensions of inclusion, diversity, inclusive excellence, and all formulations of that, which come into play. But I have a lot more to say about how that either helps or maybe doesn't help as much as we hope. And so really looking forward to hearing more from the other panelists, and certainly I'm interested in your questions and thoughts and experiences during this very, very unique time. I think I was supposed to pass, maybe to Sarah. Sarah.
Sure, I'll go ahead. Thank you all. I'm very grateful to be invited to be part of this panel with these amazing people. My name is Sarah Tarek. I am Associate Dean of Student Affairs and a general internist and head of the academic houses at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences in Little Rock. We are in our 5th year of our learning community. We actually call them academic houses. and we have 7 of those. Our academic houses are a little bit different than a lot of people in the way in that they are not necessarily incorporated into the meat and potatoes of the curriculum. Our LCs are really focused on coaching and creating that faculty-student relationship, as well as student-student relationships. So in our academic houses, for example, host our Big Little program, where we assign the bigs to the new freshmen who are coming in. We also have our academic house faculty help students navigate through what we call the transitions. So there's one-on-one relationships with the step one. We have a step one independent study course that all of our M2s enroll in, and they're assigned to their academic house advisor, and they check in with their advisor every 5 days or so. And then our focus, of course, as well as so many of you, is also on wellness and really helping create safe spaces for our students. And so, I'll get into some of the lessons learned as well and some of the best practices, but that's really what we're looking at. We're still sort of in our infancy, and I'm really excited actually to hear about Danika's, their executive coaching program, because that's something that I think we would want to do in the near future. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm up next. My name is Thamana, and I'm a third-year medical student at the University of Washington and one of the student leaders. And our school, I guess, is unique in the sense that, and I'll let Dr. Jackson jump in too, because she's at UW as well, but we are a 5-state medical school. So we have about 6 sites, 2 in Washington. And essentially we have colleges for each of the sites. I think for Seattle, we have 2 sites or 2 colleges because we have 100 students, 240, I think, in total for each class. And so within each college, there's a line of faculty who are paired with 5 or so students, and there's a longitudinal connection that way that lasts all 4 years for mentorship. And then we have a lot of other staff who are available for step tutoring and planning for residency, et cetera. And then along with that, there's a Big Sib, Little Sib program. And that program is really fun for me because my Big Sib and most of the other Big Sibs and Little Sibs are actually within the same mentorship group. And so there's some sort of connection in that way too, and knowledge that's passed on. Dr. Jackson, do you want to add in anything? I'm sure I missed a lot.
You did great. The only other thing I'd say is that ours is a learning community that teaches clinical skills and is involved in feedback, but also not involved in assessment, and then longitudinal mentoring, both of those kind of domains. You did great. Thanks, Thamana.
I think
Hey everybody, I'm Jason, and I am at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. I have been in the School of Medicine for about 7 years, and most of that time have worked with our Learning Communities program. Some of our mentors, and actually our Learning Communities director is in this workshop as well. So that's awesome. Get lots of good knowledge there. But we are sort of like Sarah at Arkansas. We are primarily a non-clinical skills program. So we do wellness, we do medical ethics in the preclinical curriculum is primarily done through our Learning Communities program. We do some cultural competency curriculum and things related to being a doctor in the 3rd and 4th year, but not necessarily clinical skills through our learning communities. We have 11 learning communities, and our students are all together for the first 2 years. And then they go to one of 4 campuses for their 3rd year. And most of them will come back to Birmingham, to the main campus for their 4th year, at least for some portion of their 4th year. And on the regional campuses, a lot of our faculty, or at least a good portion of our faculty on the regional campuses are volunteer. And so that also creates some challenges and some opportunities as it relates to some of the things that we're going to talk about today, even, and making sure that with students' experience can be widely different when all of your faculty clinicians aren't receiving the same trainings and same coachings as some of the employees of the hospitals are. And so But yeah, so that's sort of what we do in our Learning Communities program. And I want to ask, if I can, just for a second, if you are in this workshop and it's your first time to be at an LCI meeting, will you like thumbs up or do something on your reaction so we can see? I love it. It's so great. We're so glad to have y'all. And it's really important to know that you're here. And it's also really important to let you know that when the LCI says panel, that does not mean that we know what we're talking about. So I just want to make sure that everyone, if it's the ones who've been around, you already know that we don't know what we're talking about necessarily. But I just want everyone who's a first time attendee to know that we are a panel of fellow colleagues and fellow strugglers through all of this. So if you're looking for expertise, you should go find another workshop. But if you're looking for folks who are just trying to figure it out with you, then stay put. We're happy to have you.
Well said, Jason. I think one of the things that has been enormously clear to all of us is that none of us really know how to do everything just right during this time, but we certainly can learn from each other and get inspiration and ideas from each other. And that's what we hope our panelists will feel today, is receiving some inspiration and some ideas, and also a feeling that you're not alone if you're struggling at your own school with a variety of these issues. Golly, those of us who have been doing this for a while are struggling in all the ways. So it's good to have company in that space, and also some mutual support. So I'm going to share back my screen, and we're going to go into 4 overarching domains, and we have each one of our panelists is going to follow up with a little bit more information on each of these domains, and then we'll open for Q&A. As we go, I encourage you all to throw into the chat questions that are coming up as we're going through these domains, because I'm sure that there will be many that come up. And we're going to start with the first domain, which is individualized support for our URIM students. And in this domain, we've talked a lot across a lot of schools at how we do faculty and student pairings. Some students are paired with their faculty randomly, and some schools are experimenting with more identity matched pairings where it's possible. Many schools are doing some specific training for faculty and equitable approaches to mentorship and teaching, but especially in mentorship. And then empowering and enabling the creation of safe spaces for student support. And so I'm going to turn it over to Thamana, who can provide a little bit more context.
Thank you. So I'll start off with the first bullet about the 2 ways of approaching faculty mentorship with students. And there's really a lot of pros and cons to both. So if we do it in a randomized fashion, there's a lot of new things that a student can learn from someone who may be similar or completely different from them. And I'll say, for example, for me, I'm a female who's an immigrant, who's South Asian, who maybe wants to go into surgery or peds or EM or maybe everything, I don't know yet, versus my mentor who's a male, who's from a Latin background, who's an IM. And there's just been so much sharing of perspectives and ways to do things that I don't think I would have learned had my mentor been very similar to me. Now, on the other side, having a matched pairing, and it could be with identity or other interests, has a lot of pros too. And a lot of that is in sharing resources and connections and the unique struggles that may be associated with certain identities. For example, for me, I wear a hijab, and so I didn't know at the OR, what do I do? How do I go? What's correct and what's protocol, and who do I go to? And it's just really difficult to make those connections outside of what's already available through school. And so there's a lot of value through that, and even things that you don't really think about until you're there, that maybe someone ahead of time would have been able to warn you about. And so there's a lot of pros and cons to doing it both ways. I think the ideal way would be to kind of compile both, have the randomized version where you can explore and be randomized into different perspectives, but then have a second option where you can have another mentor to go to help you out with these individual difficulties that eventually come up. I think the ideal world sounds really difficult because you need to have a very diverse pool of mentors that you can reach into who also match your incoming students. And that's something that most schools are struggling across the board. And it's not just having people who identify in those ways, but also having the right people. So that's just a constant challenge and something to think about as we work towards a more equitable way to pair mentorship and support our students in the best way possible. Which actually brings me to the next point, which is making sure that our mentors are well versed in approaches to be equitable in their mentorship. And many of you, I'm sure, have had discussions about training, diversity training, and how they're not enough or they're difficult to get people to do or even get on board with, which as a student has been interesting to listen to from the side. But it really isn't enough. And I think some things that we've talked about as students and that I've heard other faculty talk about is diversifying what training really means, right? Like how you put into practice what you learn from a book or from a slide set, just like the biases that we learn about, but we don't really see until we're in those positions. It's like all of us wearing a mask. You imagine what the rest of the face looks like, and then someone takes off the mask and you're like, oh wow, I shouldn't have assumed. But I think something like the book club phenomenon that's been going on with incoming students and having them read a book about diversity and talking about it can be done with faculty as well. So certain little steps about that, and we can talk about that later. And then the last bullet doesn't necessarily go with one-on-one support, but as a student leader myself, and I'll be quick. I know I've been going on for too long. We had an issue with our class about LGBTQ, and it was in a formalized lecture, and there was a lot of strife and a lot of feelings that got hurt. And so it was really important for our class to come together in a non-formal environment that was safe and apart from the institution and other communities that are outside of our class. And so we were able to do that the with talking with a student who felt harmed, and we were able to create a safe space where students were able to ask questions, were able to share lived experiences and come together as a class to figure out, well, how do we best go forward in the next 4 years and support each other and say the right words and ask the right questions in the right ways and approach each other in the most correct way possible. So I think I'm going to pass it on to the next person, but we can talk more in the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you, Tamara, for your leadership and for sharing. Yes, we should have entitled that support and really thinking about globally students, not just URIM students, but students who may have a unique experiences in medical school in their path, particularly some challenges. So our next domain is hiring practices. And in this space, we've been thinking a lot about increasing transparency of hiring practices and application processes, proactive efforts to advance diversity of teaching faculty, being really engaging of our student body and involving them in selection and giving them some power in that space. And then the question of creating term limits for faculty where that may be necessary. So Sarah Fazio is going to speak a bit further to this.
Yes, thanks. Thank you, Molly. So we, recognized about 5 years ago that though we had a wonderful group of advisors in our society, first, many of them had been in that position for 15 years, if not longer. And second, they weren't really as representative of our student population as we would have liked them to be. So in roughly 2015 to 2016, we actually changed the job description of our society faculty and kind of enhanced it and recreated it in a model that would fit with what we were currently looking for. That's when we created the dean's role and the 2 associate advisor roles. We didn't change the number of individuals, but over the course of about 2 years, 4 of our 5 academic societies hired 10 of 15 slots, 10 of them became new hires, which really ended up expanding the racial and ethnic diversity of our faculty advisors, and also brought in a much broader diversity across LGBTQ identities as well, which I think really made a huge difference to our students. We also created term limits. Nobody has reached one yet. I think I was the first recipient of a term limit. So it's an 8-year term limit so that there's some knowledge of, and you can bring in the historical context, but then you pass it on to somebody else. And that really was never done before. Our dean is fond of saying it was kind of like a Supreme Court appointment, and he just didn't want that to be the case anymore. So in the context of creating, in recruiting the new faculty, we really made it a priority to recruit a diverse faculty for the job description. And a lot of that was kind of going out to people we knew and encouraging them to apply, and asking the students to go out and encouraging people that they knew that represented diverse identities to apply for the job, and letting them know that we were really encouraging them to do so. We were also the transparency piece that you have on the slide, I think was very important, because we did a number of these job descriptions. I think other than my own, I sat on every one of the panels. And early on, despite our best efforts, we didn't have as diverse a candidate pool as we might have liked. And we found ways to make that better as time went on. But it was really important to be transparent with the students, and to have students on that panel who were doing the interviewing and making the decisions, so that their voice could be heard, but so that they could also let the student body know how many candidates we had, and really what the panel looked like, so that it was very clear what we were doing, and we were very transparent about the fact that it was really important for us to have better representation. One of the explicit questions that we've had in every single one of our interviews for faculty anywhere in the Office of Student Affairs is asking about what they have done for diversity and inclusion over the course of their career, whatever that career might have been, whether it be with students or residents or any kind of learners. And it really is an explicit ask, and a big part of the process for identifying people who might be right for these jobs. The other bit for us, we have an Office of Recruitment and Multicultural Affairs that was set up many years ago. It's really a wonderful part of who we are at Harvard, and that has largely been a group that was set up initially for underrepresented students, but it's also expanded across the variety of identities for anybody who was more of a minority at the school. And that organization has done a huge amount of programming and recruitment and pre-matriculation programming. They have some wonderful sort of arts, and they do a whole ceremony for the African diaspora. It's just an absolutely beautiful process, and they do specific advising for the students, and they have lectureships, and they have organizational meetings. But what became really important, which gets a little bit to Thamana's comments, was that for a large period of time, that was separate from the rest of the Office of Student Affairs. But it became really clear to us that really needed to be integrated. So we call it ORMA for short. They are now at all of our advising meetings, and we share information. So our students all, we don't have students who are paired according to identities in terms of advising, but all of them have the capacity to have ORMA specific advisors. But it's information about those students and for those students are shared across both groups. And it's really been important to have the students be aware of that, and for the faculty, I think, to really appreciate what that has been and what that kind of advising is like, so that we can better understand the various identities. And then the last thing I'll say about hiring practices, we talk a lot about faculty staff. Hiring is really important, and having a diverse staff, I think, is not only critical, but important to both the students and the faculty. So we've made a huge efforts in that regard, and I think they've been positively received.
There was. I couldn't find myself on the screen. I was like, where's my unmute button? Thank you very much for that overview. That was really helpful. I hope folks will put some questions into the chat. And we're going to move on to the managing conflicts and concerns domain. We certainly have no shortage of these at our institution and beyond. And in the space of that, really thinking about creating clear and supportive processes for how to manage conflicts between students and faculty, as well as students and students, particularly when there are concerns related to discrimination. But also other concerns. And I think that these things, trying to create a transparent process for how we do that, and making sure resources are clear and available and there's support, both strategic support and emotional support when those things happen. And then proactive training in navigating conflict, really thinking ahead about what is likely to come. So Sarah Tarek is going to give us a little bit more on her thoughts.
Thank you for that. So I'll try to be brief here. And I think the best way to describe this is to sort of share what we did was really to share a story. And it's sort of related to some of the things that Tamana talked about as well. One instance happened where after George Floyd's murder, our Black students, and embarrassingly, we have a low percentage, not enough Black students who in the medical school that we want. And they asked for open forum with the chancellor, the dean, myself, etc. And so we had 3 open fora with just our Black students. And, you know, we had planned our academic houses around balancing gender, as the Munna referred to, and sort of randomly assigning, but still trying to be thoughtful about it and not putting all of our URM students in one house or not putting one student by themselves in one house. And so we really felt that was important. We had also done unconscious bias training for our faculty. And what occurred in the second open forum really shook me. And a student stood up and said, actually, my faculty advisor expressed surprise when I told her that I was making all A's. And another student stood up and said, my faculty advisor actually expressed surprise that I actually had a father. And I sort of held my head for a minute and thought, oh my God, I'm failing. The exact opposite reason for which we created these academic houses is happening. We failed. And so I had to do a big, very quickly, I did a big turnaround. And I thought, okay, we are never having this ever again. And I had always tried to balance out our faculty, you know, feelings. We don't want to hurt any feelings. We want to make sure everybody feels included. And don't want to hurt the students. And that was it. So our next faculty advisor meeting that we have monthly faculty advisor meetings since COVID, and we're on Zoom now. And so I just told the faculty, if you have not been involved in an intensive DEI training workshop, if you can't have a nuanced conversation about race and racism and what's happening to Black bodies in this country, and if you can't demonstrate that to me, then I'm not going to give you any URM students. You're staying, you can be in the, and incidentally, this faculty advisor who committed these microaggressions against our students is gone. And so I learned about this after this faculty left. So it was a very hard conversation for me to have with my faculty, because I have a lot of faculty who don't, they've been in the training, but they really haven't, you know, I think we all need to be very transparent and very clear about how we feel about this issue. And I sort of felt that I needed to push the faculty on this. And so I rearranged our brand new freshman who just joined in August. I rearranged it, and I connected our URM students with URM faculty. And if I couldn't do that, then I connected them purposely with faculty who I basically said, if you're not woke, you're not going to do that. You're in a different category. And that sounds horrible, but I had to do that because I felt like 4 years of academic house programming had really failed our students who in many ways were very vulnerable and already feeling isolated. And so that to me was a huge lesson in trying to be as clear and in terms of managing concerns that our students had about discrimination. And in terms of navigating conflict, I don't have time to go into this, but I'll just refer you all and I'll put it in the chat. We've had a horrible, horrible social media conversation with a group of students around race. And both students on either side of the debate left very hurt One student even put in a mistreatment report. And this was not the student who was the underrepresented minority. And so what I had to do was navigate that on my own, and spend 1 hour each. It was a very time intensive process, but I use a lot of interfaith. I've been involved in interfaith efforts for most of my life, and I use a lot of the interfaith conversational guidelines that with both of those students. And I didn't get to resolution necessarily, but I got to peace. So understand that when you're dealing with such deep rooted conflicts, you may not get to full resolution, but hopefully you can get to a place where the students feel somewhat safer and at peace at least. And I'll share some of those websites with you.
Thanks for sharing the websites and for your leadership in all the spaces. Speaking of trust, the last domain is in the space of accountability and thinking about enhancing our accountability for our faculty and I'll say staff, and creating effective approaches to longitudinal training for them as well as our students. Creating 360 evaluations perhaps, and creating accountability for conversations, and then doing some goal setting and measuring is what we are doing working. Jason Noah is going to lead us on this piece.
Sure. And I think the two, thanks, Molly. I think the 2 points that I sort of want to just focus on are at least as related to what we've done or what we've tried to do at UAB, what we are trying to do at UAB is the longitudinal training program for faculty and then training for the LC leadership. And I think, as Caroline Harada, who's actually in the workshop, and she has led the effort on getting training for our faculty mentors. We do twice a year, we do a faculty retreat as a half-day retreat, and we always try to have some sort of continuing education component to it. And, I think what we've learned from our mentors, both experientially and just the feedback that we've gotten from them is that it can't be a one and done type endeavor. There's no, a lot of our faculty mentors, felt like they need more training than just a one session and a half-day retreat. And that's not going to make it possible for them to lead conversations and not going to make it possible for them to have all the tools in their toolbox to lead conversations. And, the first time we sort of did this training and then did a session on it, we had variety of outcomes. We had some sessions that went really deep and went really into some very sensitive subjects. And then we had some that just didn't. And I think it's also speaks to how the personalities of our learning communities, some learning communities have different levels of trust. And so they're going to be able to have these conversations more easily. Some of our learning communities may not have that level of trust within the group. And so it makes having these conversations a little bit harder and makes it easier to default to less intense areas of debate, less intense kind of controversial topics, when really that may not be what we need. And so I think we have tried over the years to at least, and I was trying to think about this earlier today, I think we've almost had about one of our retreats every year, maybe it's not quite that much, focused on some sort of training, even if it's just a conversation about how we might handle these conversations, how we might handle an upcoming session that deals with this, strategies that have worked. We brought in outside groups. And I think that's really important too, is, making sure that there are good resources. And we found some from the undergraduate side of our campus that have been really helpful for us and for our faculty mentors in that. And then we also heard from our student leaders. So we have students in our learning communities who are elected as reps, student representatives within their groups. And they also talked about the fact that they would appreciate training around these conversations, because oftentimes they're the ones that get confronted with an initial student who's upset, or an initial student who has had a disparaging or racist comment made to them, and they don't know what to do. They don't know how to navigate these situations either, because the person that made the comment might be a friend of theirs or might be somebody that they know. And so how do they have these conversations. And so I don't know that we've really gotten a good plan for that yet, but I think it's something that we have talked about and how we can, more than just the LC session. So we're sort of training our faculty to lead these conversations that hopefully is training the students. But I think sometimes our students are saying we need more than just the session. We need something that, that we can go through as well. And just missing the assumption that they might have received that at some point and hearing from them that they probably haven't. And so I think that's sort of where we are in the process.
Thank you, Jason. We are going to move on to lessons learned. You heard several lessons learned from our panelists, and Danica Franks is going to share at least one or two more, and then we'll open for questions. And I welcome you all to start to put your questions in the chat, and we'll elevate them to the panel.
Thanks, Molly. And I think Jason's frame around that last comment is probably precisely where I'd like to lead us in this part of the conversation. I think it's recognized that if you have a learning community construct within your medical school, that these are individuals that are identified, recruited, brought on board, for one of the most trusted positions that you can really have within a medical school. And that is to work in a very unique way, no matter what your structure is, no matter how you've set up your learning community, but to work in a very student-facing capacity. And I think the natural translation to that kind of a role is that whenever there is a circumstance of paramount, such as what we've been navigating in these past few months. And I don't even want to just say in these past few months, I want to acknowledge that what we are navigating has been going on for hundreds of years. And I think that's an incredibly important framework. I've had this conversation with a lot of my students, but one of the reasons why I bring that up is because while we promise to march with you, advocate with you, yell this from the top of the mountaintops, this is an ongoing, systemic, down to the root and core of really who we are and where we are as a country, and even, globally throughout different contexts, whatever your identity is, wherever you're from, there's some element of this kind of oppression within society. And so I think it's really important to elevate that. I think we are experiencing this as an undergraduate medical education community in a different way because of the environment that we are in, and also because of the pandemic. I mean, so just to kind of put that into the forefront. But one of the frames that I think is important around that is, whereas your LC faculty are hired for their, or brought on board or recruited, or however they are brought into that position, they're brought there for unique reasons. They are not always the individuals who need to go before the students to facilitate these kinds of conversations. And I want to separate this into kind of two constructs. That's the reality of where we are. Okay. And I think that thinking about a little bit around what Jason shared, we all have diversity, inclusive excellence training. At least if we don't, we should. But sitting through a training, and passively absorbing an expert's lesson or instruction or whatever it is, does not equate you then to be the translator of these kinds of practices. And one of the things, a lesson learned that I'd love to share, not so much from what we've experienced, but just in my own lived experiences, is that you need to put your most expert person with the most expertise in this area in front of students when you are addressing these topics. To not ensure that you have done that could create far more harm than probably what was even intended. One of the things that we've done, so I want to maybe now mention too, that it is highly important that you recruit for individuals who can do this well, right? But with the reality of where we are, we have to acknowledge that not everyone that is in that position can do this well. And so it's better to accept reality and make a plan than it is to ignore that and say, well, they're the LC faculty person and they get to handle this conversation. I will say that we, in our coaching setup and paradigm, definitely recruited for individuals. We ask questions about diversity and inclusive excellence in the hiring process. I think those are all really important and they matter. As I put into the chat, I think we have to look at faculty as a whole, not only just those that we put into learning community constructs, but if we really embody inclusive excellence within our institutions, then how do we measure this competency in your role as an identity, in your role as a faculty member, no matter what you're doing, right? How do we value that? How do we reward that? You know, those are all really important questions. But it really is important to ensure, and one model that we've used that has actually worked well is we have big conversations around this. So we host more of like a town hall kind of setup, courageous conversations. We bring in someone to moderate and facilitate that dialogue. We're a small school, so I acknowledge that for those that have bigger cohorts of students, this is a much more flexible platform for us to adapt. We have 60 students per class. But that has actually worked well. And then once that conversation is had, we have found that it's easier for our coaches to be able to engage with students and kind of begin that one-on-one work that's just as important. The last thing I'll say is that coaching as a profession is a little bit of a nice model because it puts our students, we're able to share with them that coaches and really the practice of coaching you don't have to be the expert of anything. So coaching is really about asking powerful questions. And so when you are doing a coaching session with someone, it's really the art of letting the individual be the expert of themselves. In fact, the mantra is that every person that you coach is creative, resourceful, and whole. And in that, they are the expert of themselves. They have the answers that are most applicable to who they are. And so I will say that for our coaches, that's a nice model to be able to navigate through even conversations like these, and that we're not lifting them up as the expert. We're lifting them up as someone, and we've trained them as someone to ask powerful questions and let the students' lived experiences, let their identities roll out and inform the dialogue and the exchange. And so it really is a nice model for even hosting these kinds of conversations. And perhaps with that, I'll open it up for any other lessons learned that our panelists want to share. And then certainly, as Molly shared, put your questions into the chat. We'd really love to have a community dialogue around this.
And we welcome folks to turn on their cameras if they would like. We're going to attempt to let people just go for it and unmute themselves and be brave and dive in with a question if you have one.
I can share. We've been working on this as well as we have faculty development on a weekly basis for our learning community mentors, and we've integrated in a curriculum that's threaded intermittently throughout the year, focused on bias and anti-racism, starting with working on our own biases. And the most recent thing we tried that I have high hopes for is we did a bystander to upstander training, which we hired a local theater group that is expert in this and that does this in other settings. And using Zoom and breakout rooms, we spent an afternoon actually with role playing this. It's an important skill for our mentors who do teach clinical skills, and at times will approach a patient and various comments can occur in the encounter. And in the past, people would be like, paralyzed about what to do or wouldn't intervene. And so this bystander to upstander training, I think, was something that's going to help us address those issues that definitely come up in the variety of patients that we into when we're teaching clinical skills in the hospital.
I agree. That's a big tension, because you obviously want the faculty who are involved to be the qualified people who are passionate about it. One challenge that I faced at Arkansas, which I'm now relieved because of a couple of new faculty who have joined, which was for 5 years, no one wanted to talk about diversity and equity and inclusion. No one was comfortable with it. So anytime there was a challenge in the class, it became, frankly, the brown girl's job. And At one point last year, I said, brown girl's not doing it anymore. You guys have to, we need a white person out there talking about this too. So help me out. And so that was a risk that this faculty member took, and she did a phenomenal job of it, thank goodness. But there's that challenge too.
I have a question for the panel. I'm Alex from the University of Washington. And, one of the things we've been being asked by our students absolutely appropriately is how we can integrate them more into decision making. And as part of that, integrate all students into decision making around improvements in our learning community and ways to be more equitable. And as part of that, what students have asked is that we screen students who are on these working groups for isms, and make sure that the structures of the working groups are truly equitable and power relationships are mitigated as much as possible. And these asks, I think, are very reasonable asks given the institutional racism that is present in our society and in our institutions. And it's hard to figure out quite how to do it right. And we don't want to place the burden on the students who are already working overtime to figure out how to do it. And if people have resources or ways they've done it at their institutions, I'd love to hear more.
Well, I can certainly give some thoughts. I would hate to say that I think that we are handling this perfectly. I think the screening for isms is actually something that through a recent climate survey that we did at our school, there was actually an explicit request. It wasn't student generated, but it was actually something that came out of our staff and faculty that we specifically look at individuals that are serving in capacities on committees and whereby, maybe some of their how can we educate around topics, for example, of gender inclusion and just other things that are emerging as areas that we need to look at as an institution. I will say that probably the most success that we've had so far is certainly including our students in our diversity and inclusion panel, rather standing committee. And they have, two positions. It's probably one of my favorite committees that I'm a participant on because it involves the curriculum, the co-curriculum, students, staff, faculty. It just brings together, community members, so many diverse perspective and ideas. And I think, we are the ones that need to drive, those conversations and dialogue. Again, I don't have a perfect answer for this. I'm curious to see maybe if some of the other panelists too have had some experiences with that, or others maybe that are on this call.
Well, I'll add to the we don't have it figured out group. I think, one of the things that Caroline and I have been talking a lot about and sort of grappling with is just and Sarah alluded to this, sort of the lack of diversity in the class can make it really challenging, to one of the drivers of underrepresented medicine in our class, each class is our MD PhD medical scientist training program. And so that's great for the first 2 years, but then those students leave to go to grad school for 4 years and take a chunk of our underrepresented students with them. And so that's one thing. The other thing that we have sort of been, and maybe it's just me, and again, just takes me longer to learn every lesson, but sort of, it's not enough to be diverse. What our students want is diversity that looks like them every single time. And so, it's not enough to have, if they want students who are African American, they want students who are Latino, they want students who are LGBT. And so it's sort of, it even complicates the challenge or makes it a little bit harder to think about when you're needing not just diversity generally, but diversity specifically for students.
And I'll comment on that too. I think this is a nice frame back to what Thamana was saying around, how do you even pair your students with their faculty, their learning community faculty? Because I think, for us, we're a school that does that randomly. With the coaching model, our premise is that we have hired individuals that we believe are strong representatives of diversity and inclusive thinking. we have trained them with a skill around being able to deploy that. So actually demonstrating, I like how Sandrine this morning mentioned that it's not just about the training, it's about demonstrating and providing skills and then asking the individuals to demonstrate those skills. And so with that thought process, we believe that randomly placing them with their learning community mentors should work. Now, with that being said, I think that the part that's challenging, and certainly as someone who identifies as a woman of color, representation matters. I grew up in an era, this is an example, it's not med-ed specific, but when I was a little girl, I couldn't even find a doll that looked like me, and so things have changed significantly. They've not changed enough. And I will say that it is important for our students to see individuals who represent their identities. Now, the challenge to that is you don't necessarily know what is the most valuable identity for the student until they get there. And so for us, we do our pairing of our students ahead of their arrival or their matriculation. So for me to try to guess at that, or even put out a survey in that pre-matriculation period, we have found is not as helpful. And so to that point, I really liked Mana's suggestion that you have your LC pairing. You are aggressive about training that group and making sure that they are prepared to be in front of in a very student-facing role. But then to that extent, you bring out an additional peripheral tier of a different type of mentorship or access that really the students can say, okay, this is the identity that I want to seek out the most, someone who is representative of me. And then they can be a little bit more led in that area as opposed to you trying to guess on that. So that so far has been helpful. I don't think it's perfect, but I think it is a strategy to look at, and I appreciate the construct around that.
I just want to add, with regards to challenges of getting, student involvement and then representation. UW is not a diverse school, so we're probably not going to get that from our students in terms of, being involved in panels or interviews or certain committee memberships. And I think in that regard, like you said, Dr. Molnar, being kind of transparent about who's willing to participate, like who wants to apply to these positions, what their stances are, and kind of sharing that with the student body, just like we did when we elected medical student association members. That way your students know that you are looking for certain types of people, but these are the people who want to be involved. And I think it lessens the burden of having underrepresented students fill those positions because they need to. And then the rest of the student body understands that these are the people who are most passionate about it. And it's not that the school itself is picking people who aren't representative. I think that's one of the biggest issues in our class as well, where people are like, well, why are they serving in this committee when we have other members? But then they didn't realize that those people didn't apply. They don't want to be a part of it. And so that's been a real struggle with our class. And I think transparency goes a long way in helping people understand until we get to a point where we can do these things well.
Thank you, Thamana. That's very wise. Thank you.
We probably have time for one last question. Does anyone have a burning one that could be answered by any of our panelists?
If not, I just had a comment about what Jason posted in the chat, which is just the whole notion that while so important for learning communities to embrace this and be good at this, it's really the entire school that needs to be able to do it. And one thing, and we've struggled with that a lot. And I think to the extent, and it's not easy, that you can collect some data, obviously, without there being student names associated with it, and give it back to the department chairs and the division chiefs. it's really very helpful. When you're talking about a learning environment, you can specifically say that there was a disparity or X, Y, or Z happened. That feels much more real, and we've had some progress in terms of accountability and leadership saying, well, this is actually not good. This is not what I want my department to look like. But that's really important, because even though our learning communities are, we have made them much more robust in this realm, when the students go out there and they're dealing with faculty who aren't even giving it a second thought, that's harmful, and that needs to be addressed.
Well, we are at time, and I want to honor folks' breaks. What a privilege to be able to listen to all of my panelists. I learned something every time I talk to this crew, and I'm grateful for those of you who spoke from the crowd as well and brought forward questions. Please do reach out to us, and if there's questions, I'm happy to put my email in the chat and have folks reach out and encourage panelists, if they're willing to receive questions. Grateful to everybody for being here. And you all are on break. No, we have a
Nope.
featured oral presentation. There is no break.
Keep trucking, everybody. No break.
Go, get out of here. Go, go, go. There's a featured oral presentation starting in 0 minutes. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.